Never thought I'd be wearing this shirt and holding this Bible at the same time. Forgive me. Our scripture today will be the same as last week with a little addition. We are inside of the text of the book of Joel for this series of generational listening. So Joel is the prophet that is quoted in the Pentecost story. In the book of Acts, when they tell the story of the Pentecost, which is when all of the people were gathered and the tongues of flame came down like from the heavens, and each of the people were given the gift of being able to speak a different language to be understood by others. That was interpreted as the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy. And the book of Joel is quoted there. So hear these words from the book of Joel about how everyone of every generation is given voice to proclaim the good news of God. From chapter 1, verses 1, 2, and 3. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, son of Pethuel. Hear this, O elders, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. And from chapter 2, then afterward, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female slaves in those days, I will pour out my spirit. A word for our hearing. Just as the good news from God is best heard and received from generation to generation to generation, it is good for us to listen to one another across our differences, across the different generations that bind together this church family. Today we continue our generational listening by listening to those of the boomer generation. We will hear testimonies today, and we will make some theological sense out of these boomer testimonies. I would like to invite us to listen with open ears and open hearts to those who will speak, beginning with Russ Claggett.
Good morning. I had a speech all prepared, but I'm having flashbacks now. After seeing that, I can see the high-heeled boots I used to wear and the Nehru jackets and the silk shirts and the disco ball, and I'm discombobulated. Yeah. I'm in real trouble now. So, my name is Russ Claggett, and I'm a baby boomer. I feel better about saying that. So I was born in 1956, which makes me 58 years old. When I was born, my mother had toxemia, and I came 3 weeks early. So at that time, in that kind of situation, they immediately took me from my mother. She was not allowed to touch me. I was in an incubator for 3 weeks before she was allowed to hold me and take me home. And home at that time was where my mom stayed to take care of me, and soon 3 sisters within the next 4 years. And I think when people think of the legacy of my generation, the baby boomers, the image that comes to mind is the turbulent 60s. Hippies and drugs and free sex and music, protests and war. But when I think of my generation, I think of how far our country came and has come during that time. How my mother's life changed from the time I was born until the time I went to college. The women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, inventions, man on the moon, Tang, right? Who can forget Tang? Microwave ovens, fast food, the creation of a whole new middle class in America. I think of advances in medicine. Compare when I was born, where my mom didn't get to touch me for 3 weeks, and fast forward to when my sister had her first child, who was 12 weeks early and was in a neonatal care unit at Sparrow Hospital in Lansing. From the moment my niece was born, my sister and her husband were allowed to touch her and hold her and fondle her. How far we have come. I remember as a child going to my elementary school to get my polio vaccine, the little sugar cube with the pink dot in it. How far we have come in America with eradicating disease and helping people in the healthcare field. I think of music. Jim played that wonderful Cat Stevens version this morning of Morning Has Broken. We went from doo-wop to rock and roll to, what was that music that you played, Brent? Disco, right? To heavy metal. A crazy, crazy time in music. And so many advances in science and in industry. You know, our motto was make love, not war, and that really hasn't worked out so well for us. When I look at the other side of my generation, the dark side of my generation, I think of the riots in Detroit in 1968, the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and I think about the forced busing of African American students to my elementary school, to my junior high, and to my high school, and how that action impacted their lives. I think of how we as white society reached out to help others by asking them to act and be like we were. Social justice was great as long as you followed the prescription that white America dispensed. We had all the answers and didn't listen to the voices of those we were trying to help. We knew what was best, but we really didn't know much of anything. We were the generation that not only had to have better lives than our parents because they were doing everything they could to help that happen, but we also had to keep up with the Joneses, right? So bigger and better and faster and more expensive became our mission, and we failed to pay attention to what our progress was doing to our families and our environment. I grew up in the Congregational Church in Lansing. My grandfather was a congregational minister. My mother was director of Christian education at Pilgrim Congregational Church in Lansing. So I have congregational blood in me. In my generation, from a religious standpoint, we brought you Jesus Freaks, and we brought you Jesus Christ Superstar. We also brought America the rise of the televangelists, Jimmy and Tammy Faye Baker, Jimmy Swaggart. But I will say that my generation also birthed Emily, Joy, and Tom. The good news is that my generation hasn't quit. We haven't given up on the dream. We helped elect an African American as the commander-in-chief of our nation, something I am incredibly proud of. We volunteer. We are helping others understand the issue of privilege that exists in this country. and we are starting to listen now before we act. Don't give up on us.
Thanks, Russ. Chris Kindy was supposed to be speaking this morning, and I got a call from Chris last night. She was called down to be with her daughter and her new grandson in Chicago. Her grandson's going to be going in for some tests tomorrow, and she needed to be with family. But I met with Chris during the week, and she shared some of her own reflections, some of which amplify things that you have already named, Russ, and I just want to share some of those with you this morning. So as a woman, one of the things that Chris identified as a formative experience was the expansion of opportunities for women during her lifetime. Unlike her mother, she wasn't limited to being either a secretary, a nurse, or a teacher, or staying at home. As Chris came of age, she, as a woman, was encouraged to continue her education, to go on to college, was told that you can be whatever you want to be. She had opportunities that her mother didn't have, and with those opportunities came a new level of financial independence, new career opportunities, a higher standard of living with two-income households. But the shadow side of that was, as a woman growing up in the boomer generation, she inherited the legacy of all the gender roles from the generation before her. So she was still expected to be the homemaker, still expected to be the primary parent raising the children, still expected to be the one responsible for getting meals together, for doing shopping, for entertaining guests, for hosting visitors. Remember that commercial that played during the 70s? I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never let you forget you're a man. Don't remember what they were selling. But that was their jingle. And as a result of that, I think women in the boomer generation often felt exhausted and frustrated and resentful. Chris said, no matter how hard I worked, I never felt like I could give anything the attention that it deserved. Not my family, not my career, not myself. And so the shadow side of our generation, especially for boomer women, was often a deep sense of inadequacy, of not being enough. Chris also talked about that altruism that you mentioned, Russ, that desire to make a difference, to contribute to the welfare of others, that comes out of a deep sense of compassion, genuine concern for others, especially the poor and most vulnerable people of our day. But the shadow side of that is that we often did it out of kind of colonial perspective, this idea that we know what's best for you. We know what you need. We know how to make things better for you. And then when our programs and our initiatives and our interventions didn't work, we often blamed the victims. The other thing that Chris named that was significant in shaping her orientation to the world is the youth orientation of the boomer generation. So think about Bob Dylan's great 1972 hit, Forever Young. What's beautiful about that in the boomer generation is our orientation to the future, our openness to new ideas, new technologies. We had to learn how to use computers in our generation. We didn't grow up with it. New ways of doing things. An orientation to being lifelong learners. A commitment to take care of our bodies as best we can, to stay active, to get exercise, to eat well, to be healthy. I think the shadow side of that for the boomer generation is that we haven't always taken ourselves as seriously as we ought to. I think our orientation around youth has sometimes made it hard for us to value the wisdom that we've accumulated throughout our life experiences, the lessons that we have to pass on. Chris was reflecting as a new grandmother on what her legacy will be to her new grandson, her 4-week-old grandson. What is it that I want him to know? What is the wisdom that I have to pass on to my grandson? For us boomers, legacy thinking is new work that we are just now beginning to take up.
Need 'em. Good morning, my name is Mark Johnson, and apparently I'm a baby boomer. I've always bristled at labels and like to think of myself as hard to categorize. I've been married for quite some time, but it almost didn't happen because my wife, Susan, initially labeled me as a dumb jock. However, I was pretty determined and eventually broke down her resistance. And 33 years later, I think she's figured out that maybe I'm not that accomplished of an athlete after all. Labels lead to stereotypes, and stereotypes are usually overly broad, unfair, and divisive. So when Tom called upon me to participate in this generation to generation program, I was somewhat negative and said to myself, don't lump me in a group and give me a label that can't possibly define me. But truthfully, I had not previously given this much thought and was not clear on what it even meant to be a baby boomer. So I've been doing a little research to find out if I actually am one and what it means to be one. As it turns out, depending on your source, the 76 to 80 million American children born from 1946 to 1964 comprise the generation labeled baby boomers. I was born in 1958. So by that definition, I am a baby boomer. Those of us born from 1946 to 1955 are further defined as leading edge or early boomers. And those born between 1955 and 1964 are trailing edge or late boomers. That's late boomers, not late bloomers. But hold that thought. I'm still not thrilled with labels, but this one only serves to place me in a demographic and does not completely define me. Though at this point, I have to admit, some of the demographics descriptors do apply. First, a few interesting factoids about the boomers. We now represent about a quarter of the roughly 315 million Americans. We control 80% of all personal financial assets. We're responsible for 50% of all consumer spending. The oldest boomers are now turning 70. Approximately 2/3 of all seniors 65 and over, and 60% of those 50 to 64 have at least one chronic disease. It's no surprise we account for 77% of the prescription drug spending and 61% of the over-the-counter drug spending. We also account for 80% of all leisure travel. We will inherit $8.4 trillion from our parents and grandparents. That's trillion, lots of zeros. However, a third of us plan to leave our money to charitable organizations instead of our children. There may be hope for us yet. So what can I tell you about the circumstances that shaped my life, values, and outlook? Family played a big part. I'm the fourth of 5 children born from 1949 to 1961, our own little Johnson family boom. The FDA approved oral contraceptives, the pill as it's now known, in the summer of 1960, and the Johnson boom ended with the birth of my younger sister the following spring. 1964 marked the end of the wider boom as well. Coincidence? I think not. Soon after, in the 1967 Summer of Love, leading-edge boomers were transitioning out of the baby boom into the Big Bang, just fewer babies. The Vietnam War. The draft ended in 1973, and registration for the draft was suspended in 1975, just a few months before I would have had to register for the draft. But the Vietnam War still had a big influence on me because it was a major source of friction in my family. My brother was trying to avoid the draft, talking about moving to Canada. My father was trying to prevent that. It was like this a lot in that time. My father was well connected, pulled some strings, and managed to get him into the National Guard, which allowed him to remain in school, become a weekend warrior, and avoid active duty. Jimmy Carter's draft of 1980 excluded anyone born before 1960, so I missed that one too. College. I grew up knowing I was going to college. My parents went to college, my older siblings went to college, and I was going to college. We never talked about when or if, the only question was where. My parents paid for my brother to attend Tulane University, paid for my older sister to go to the University of Iowa, several others before finally graduating from Humboldt State in California. She was definitely a child of the 60s. Paid for my middle sister to attend Miami of Ohio. I could go anywhere I wanted to go if I could get in. Money was not an issue. When it came time to select a college, the Naval Academy was one of the schools recruiting me for football. I had the grades and the scores to get in, and my dad, who served in the Navy and had connections through business with high-ranking naval officials and knew many powerful politicians, he had the endorsements lined up if I wanted to go. I wanted no part of that. And I went to Indiana University as an aspiring nuclear physicist on a full-ride football scholarship instead. U.S. military popularity was an all-time low through the 70s and was clearly no place for me at the time. That's not to say I don't have the deepest respect for our military, and what our greatest generation did for us can never be repaid in total. But sorry, Navy. And I'm not 100% certain that I can honestly say that my decision had nothing to do with the fact that the Naval Academy did not allow women until after I had attended or decided to attend IU. Maybe not so dumb after all. Other events touched on by Russ and touched on by Tom for Chris. Clearly the Cold War, Watergate, Nixon's resignation, the Kennedy assassinations, Martin Luther King's assassination. I was actually in Memphis the day after he was killed. We had a police escort into our motel that night and out of town the next morning. White police, lots of them around. Occurred while I was growing up. But I was too busy with school, sports, scouts, and just plain having fun to pay much attention. Remember the late bloomer reference? Thanks to Karen Parker, who invited me to this church, Tom Ott, TR, Emily Joy, and many other amazing and inspiring members of this church community from all generations. I've been doing some serious catch-up work on some of these social histories and events and learning a great deal about some of the messes I grew up in and through. and what still needs to be done about some of it. I may have come to the party late, but I'm gaining understanding and taking action. I will not leave this world regretting that I stood idly by and did nothing when there were things that could have been done. I hope our boomer legacy includes 70 million or more helping to take up some of this unfinished business. Materialism. How or why it happened, I can't say, but I'm definitely guilty as charged in this regard. He who dies with the most toys wins. I've been playing this game for a long time, and up until a few years ago, I was sure I was winning, or at least in the lead pack. A peek in my basement at the 70-inch HD TV, 2,000-watt surround sound system would be sufficient evidence to convict. The 7,000-pound SUV in the parking lot, for which I buy 44 gallons of $4 a gallon diesel at a time, might add a few years to the sentence. I can remember putting Maseratis, Ferraris, and Lamborghinis on my Christmas list at a very early age. Lamborghini was not even in business until 1963 when I was 5, but I had an eye for nice toys early on. This Rolex is not my fault. She gave it to me when I was 50, but I've wanted one since I was in graduate school in 1987 when I saw one of my professors wearing one. He also had a Porsche Turbo Carrera whale tail, but that's way too small for me. A twin-turbo Bentley Continental is more my size. Just kidding. I'm keeping the Hoosier Mobile for another 100,000 miles. Unfortunately, the boomer legacy related to materialism is that many of us have not saved adequately for a comfortable retirement. That's not true for Susan and me, but it is very true for far too many. As a result, there are many working later in life, and many actually think they will literally work until they die. Those depending only on Social Security for their retirement are likely taking a big risk. I hope our legacy does not include a ruinous financial burden on the generations that follow us. I'm also not thrilled with knowing that much of the greed and financial upheaval of the recent past was perpetrated in large part by self-interested boomers. We have not yet seen the end of that fallout, and I think more than a few are still headed to prison for their roles in that fiasco. Environment. I'm afraid that another part of our legacy will be the impending environmental disaster we call global warming. It comes as an unintended consequence of our materialism. Ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, weather's becoming more severe, and we're losing species at an accelerating rate. It may be too late to reverse that in our lifetime, but we must try, or it won't change in our children's lifetime either. It's not all gloom and doom. There's some good stuff. I think we've had a hand in some good stuff. There's still much work to do, but we've created a more inclusive and tolerant society. Martina Navratilova was born in 1956. She's a boomer. She became the first openly gay professional athlete in any sport. She's led the way for many others. Jason Collins in the NBA, and most recently, Michael Sam of the NFL. Contrary to recent media reports, and I'm embarrassed to be called a football player some days, there's evidence of improving women's equality and men's growing respect for it. There's a story on the front page of the Inquirer talking about it today, as a matter of fact. Title IX in 1972 was enacted with help from feminist activist boomers. An appreciation for cultural diversity too long denied has much boomer support behind it. A society that no longer turns a blind eye to prejudice or pollution has its roots in boomer activism. It is not too late for the late boomers to become late bloomers and make a significant impact over the next 20, 30, or even 40 years that we will be around. Bill Gates is a pretty vivid example of this. He is marshaling resources of an unimaginable magnitude that can solve more than a few technical issues standing in the way of improved quality of life for millions of people on this earth. He's enlisted the help and resources of the likes of Warren Buffett, Paul Allen, Mark Zuckerberg, Carl Icahn, Michael Bloomberg, Richard Branson, Larry Ellison, and Barron Hilton, to name but a few. What wisdom might I pass on to generations following the boomers? Don't sit on the sidelines and wait for someone else to take care of what needs taken care of. One person can make a difference. It's never too late to get started. And watch out for these guys. They're uncanny at getting you to move outside your comfort zone. And if you're not careful, you'll end up learning all kinds of things that are interesting, important, and meaningful. You may even be moved to do something about some of it. Thank you.
Thanks. So let's just take a moment and think theologically about the things that have shaped the boomer generation. As I listened to Russ and to Chris and to Mark, the thing that stood out to me theologically was this tension between individuality and community. So over and over we heard in boomer stories the importance of autonomy, of that internal sense of authority. This is a generation that does not honor the authority of other people without questioning it deeply. It's got to make sense at a personal level. The Apostle Paul has this beautiful line in his letter to the Philippians: work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Don't get caught up in groupthink. God has given you a brain, use it. Theologically, that is a deep connection with our wisdom tradition. So in the Psalms and in the Proverbs, in the book of Ecclesiastes, in Job, in all of the writings that are part of the wisdom literature of tradition, we have this elevation of wisdom that we each must seek on our own. These words from Proverbs: does not wisdom call, does not understanding raise her voice? O simple ones, learn prudence, acquire intelligence, you who lack it. Hear, for I will speak noble things, and from my lips will come what is right. The boomer generation is deeply rooted in our wisdom tradition. And out of that comes this commitment to begin recovering some of the spiritual practices of our tradition: personal prayer, devotional reading, inspirational music. With it comes a deep sense of our personal agency, this conviction that we can make a difference. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. One of the beautiful verses of Paul's letter to the Philippians. So autonomy is in our spiritual DNA. But moving forward, I think we are all growing to realize that the challenges we are facing, the problems looming ahead of us, are too big for any individual to address on their own. Global warming isn't going to be solved by composting or recycling or switching to LED light bulbs. Those are all important things to do, and none of them will reverse the trend of global warming. The growing disparity between the haves and the have-nots cannot be solved by encouraging people to open personal savings accounts. The growing racial tensions cannot be dissolved by eliminating quotas. Global terrorism won't be solved with airport scanners and drone-fired missiles. The problems, the challenges that we face in this day cannot be solved individually. So we as boomers need to be able to reach back to the wisdom of the builder generation, who came together in response to problems that were too big for anyone to handle on their own. The Great Depression, World War I, World War II. They knew how to come together for the common good. That's something we as boomers need to recover from the builder generation. We also need to reach forward to the millennials, to those who have inherited social structures that are no longer sustainable, Social Security that will be insolvent by the time they retire, health care that is increasingly becoming less and less affordable, environmental issues that can no longer be ignored. From the millennials, we learn how to form broad-based coalitions that invite everyone to the table. People who are able to share multiple perspectives. People who can help us recognize that the challenges we face and the solutions we must find will involve a great deal of complexity and require the contributions of many diverse people working together. From a theological perspective, it's the recovery of the importance of community that is at the very heart of the Christian story. In addition to our working out our own salvation with fear and trembling, we need each other. To each is given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For we are all part of the one body of Christ. Those are the tensions, the theological tensions that we have to hold together as a boomer generation. Valuing our autonomy and embracing community. May it ever be so. Amen.